Welcome back. Where had we left off? We had just talked a little bit about Madame Chrysanthème and these exoticizing and orientalizing narratives that grew really out of that imperialist gaze with which Europeans in the late 19th century looked at the Far East, China, and in this case, Japan. So the topic of this week's readings is Mori Ōgai, who really is one of the giants of the Meiji era literary scene. Very interesting figure. Born in 1862, died in 1922, spends the entire Meiji era, but is really still born in, if you want, the old Japan, right? During the Tokugawa period. He's the oldest son of a family of samurai that had served the daimyo of a domain in the south of the main island of Japan, what is today Shimane, for 11 generations. So a very prominent family. And his family were actually hereditary physicians to the daimyo. Doctors. His father had been a doctor who had received some Western learning in Nagasaki, right? That is usually referred to as rangaku, right? What I earlier mentioned, sort of Dutch learning, European learning coming to Japan by way of Nagasaki. And Mori Ōgai was expected to continue the family tradition. He also learned Dutch, but he also trained in classical Chinese, of course, and Confucian classics at the Domain Academy. So in a way, his early schooling would have been very similar to that of Huang Zunxian in many ways. Would have read the same kind of texts, would have practiced the same kind of poetry. And actually his early writings and his early translations of Western literature were all written in classical Chinese, the same kind of language that Huang Zunxian would have used. In 1872, shortly after the Meiji Restoration, the family relocates to Tokyo. So the family, was really pretty much part of the elites, would have been very wealthy. They probably owned property in Tokyo already. They moved there. He receives tutoring in German because this idea that he would become a doctor, maybe now a modern doctor, that was still very much, that was the expectation. And at the time, German really was the primary language for medical education. German science in the 19th century really were at the forefront of scientific research. Germany, or the German states, had a lot of new universities. There was a lot of funding put into education. And as I already said, the relations, especially in terms of academic exchange, diplomatic exchange, military exchange between Japan and Germany had grown very tight at that time, late 70s, 1870s, 1880s, and what grew even tighter. 1874, he's admitted to what later became Tokyo Imperial Medical School. He graduates at the age of 19. He was obviously very smart. But at the same time, he develops this intense interest in literature, all sorts of literature, Japanese literature, Chinese literature. He continues to study Chinese poetry, but also immerses himself more and more into Western literature, some of which he reads in the original, in German, but also in translation. A lot of literature is being translated at the time. He then enlists again, and this would have been just sort of the expected career path for him, with the Imperial Japanese Army, right, being the sign of a samurai family with a medical tradition. He becomes a medical officer in the army, specializes in military medicine and hygiene. And then between 1884 and 1888, he is sent to study in Germany, in a bunch of different places, Leipzig, Dresden, Munich, and Berlin. Upon his return to Japan in 1888, he translates a lot of European literature, both poetry and fiction. He also writes his own fiction, one of which, of course, one piece we're going to encounter today. But he also continues his military career. So he serves in two wars, the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95 and the Russo-Japanese War, 1905. But all along, he continues his literary activities. And as I already said, he really is one of those towering giants of the Meiji era. Now, what's interesting is this piece that we're reading, of course, is fiction, but he also wrote a lot of diaries. Whenever he traveled, when he traveled to the West, he wrote actually a pretty complete diary, Koseki Nikki, a journal of a voyage to the West, which interestingly was written in, yes, classical Chinese. Okay? And I put partial translation into English on iLearn, and I put a link to the entire diary, the Chinese version of the diary. So if you read Chinese, you can access that. I think it's really fun to see his classical Chinese. His classical Chinese is obviously very good. How, this diary is written in a very matter-of-fact way. Okay, very matter-of-fact. I just picked a few sort of interesting examples from this. And of course he departs in 1884 on board a French steamer. I told you, right, I like ships, so every PowerPoint has got to have at least one ship. He never mentions the name of the ship, unfortunately, but I think it's possible that it might have been this or something like this. So this is a liner called Niger, of Messagerie Maritime, that French steamship company that connected East Asia with Marseille. So this is the ship he might have taken, we don't know. October 13th, so this is shortly after he has arrived in Berlin. Today, Dr. Hashimoto took me to see the Minister of War, the Japanese Minister of War, Oyama. The minister said that if you carefully observe how Europeans think, how they live, what their manners are, your trip abroad will have been warranted. So very clearly they communicate these high expectations that they have toward him, to really learn, to really observe, to make the most of his stay. October 14th, I called on Dr. Hashimoto again and asked about my program of study. He replied that first I was to study under Franz Hoffmann at Leipzig, then under Max von Pettenkofer in München, and finally under Robert Koch here in Berlin. Now, Robert Koch is probably the one doctor who everybody in Germany knows, because he actually has an institute named after him, the Robert Koch Institute. Now, the Robert Koch Institute is something like the Center of Disease Control in the United States. So during the corona pandemic, it was basically in the German news every day. So he studied with Robert Koch, also with Dr. Roth in Dresden. Here's a photo from 1885 at the bottom of Ōgai. 13th of January. Tonight I attended a dance at the Royal Palace. It lasted from 8:30 to 11:30. There were 600 guests, dignitaries included, Prince Alexander von Weimar, Prince Clemens Schönberg, and many members of the Corps Diplomatique. So I think this is interesting. Oh, and the delicacies included smelt and oysters. Should always pay attention to the detail. Very interesting. They ate smelt and oysters. But I think what is really interesting is that Mori Ōgai quite clearly mixed in Germany with the very highest layers of German society, which is really quite astonishing, right? But I think it also shows you just how close that contact between Japan and Germany was at the time, right? That a Japanese, essentially a student, a young man, comes to Germany and mingles with the highest echelons of German society. November 16th, it snowed for the first time. Went to the Altes Theater and saw the comedy Raub der Sabinerinnen. Began at 7 and ended at 10. I like how he puts the time in there. So this, I think, is interesting because it shows you that while he's in Germany, while he's obviously studying very hard, while he's obviously mingling with, the highest sort of layers of German society, he also finds time to go to the theater and to read and to immerse himself in what at the time would have been really popular culture. February 13th, tonight at supper time at the Vogts, Fräulein Lucius came dashing in, exclaiming that she had something interesting, and pointed out to me the column in the newspaper about a concert they had attended, I guess the previous day. Among the prominent guests were listed a prince from Mecklenburg and the Japanese army surgeon Mori Ōgai, right? So that even Japanese newspapers take note of him. I think this is really quite stunning. April 1st, Bismarck's birthday. Everybody celebrates with feasting. Very interesting. So again, I said I posted a partial translation. It's very interesting. Something that I didn't put on the PowerPoint here is he participates in a lot of military maneuvers and observes them. And again, I think it's very interesting just how involved Japanese advisors or students in Germany were in all these processes, the German military buildup, etc. Please feel free to check it out. And again, the Chinese version is up as well, the original, right? One written in classical Chinese. Now, the diary then is highly factual, very insightful, very interesting. Yet, this fictionalized account that, of course, is really at the center of our class today, Maihime, also known as the Dancing Girl, is really a short story that Mori Ōgai wrote about his stay in Germany shortly after he had returned to Japan in 1890. And it's this short story that possibly gives us a more earnest, maybe a more sincere account of Mori Ōgai's personal experience in Germany, which is why I think it's even more interesting than this diary, and which is why I wanted you to read it. Now, the short story then, Mahime, is, you'll see, partly autobiographical. It matches some of the events described in the diaries, but, it's written from a first-person perspective, and it is also fictionalized. But at the same time, I do think it's really an interesting example of travel literature, because there are a lot of reflections about that, destination he finds himself in, Germany. At the very opening of the novel, he says, "But suddenly here I was," the narrator, that is, right, whom we mustn't confuse with Mori Ōgai. The narrator says, suddenly here I was, standing in the middle of this most modern of European capitals, Berlin, right? Which really was the most modern European capital, because it was really just being built up at that time, right? It was really only in the 1860s, 1870s, as Prussia unites the German states, it becomes this modern Germany, and it becomes that rising power in Europe. Of course, here, a railway station, right? That symbol of modernity, that symbol of progress, that symbol of transportation and travel. Anhalter Bahnhof around 1900. Berlin Alexanderplatz around 1880, how it would have looked when Ōgai went there. He, we know, also went to study in Leipzig, right? Here is a photo of Leipzig in the 1880s. Leipzig is one of Germany's oldest universities. I think it's the second oldest. And again, in the 1880s, it really would have been one of the preeminent centers of learning in Europe / the world. German used to be a much more important academic language than it is today. Here's another little excerpt from Mahime, the Dancing Girl. "One evening, I sauntered through the Tiergarten and then walked down Unter den Linden. On the way back to my lodging in Montbijoustraße, I came in front of the old church in Klosterstraße. I noticed a young girl sobbing." Very interesting. He gives us all these very distinct geographical markers, right? Tiergarten, Unter den Linden, Montbijoustraße, where he lives. Mentions this church that's there. Here's a postcard from 1902 from just that, the church on the Klosterstraße. This is a little after he was there. In 1902, the Berlin subway had opened, so that was something that he would not have seen. And then, of course, there is that young girl, that sobbing girl, who is going to be, of course, at the very center of that short story, The Dancing Girl. Now, what is interesting is that The Dancing Girl is entirely absent from the diaries, okay? So the diaries, if you want, are self-censored. The diaries are cleaned of any sort of really personal stuff. The diary is really just factual. When Mori Ōgai returns home in 1888, this young girl, who's called Elise, or Alice in the English translation that I posted, follows him to Japan. So, let me explain. I said that the story is fictional, yet it is somewhat autobiographical. So we know that Mori Ōgai had an affair with a German, young woman called Elise, who came to Japan and greatly, shocked, of course, his family, this very well-respected old family. And the family eventually intervenes, and eventually Elise has to go back to Germany. Okay? And Maihime, the story then, is published in 1890. And maybe it's sort of a way for Ōgai to come to terms with this whole thing, to write about it, in a fictionalized way. On the right, you have an image, sort of a lithography from, I don't know if this is the first edition, one of the editions of Mahime in Japan. At the bottom, you have another photo of Mori Ōgai in Germany with other Japanese students and diplomats. And as you approach this story then, I think there's a few things you always want to wear in the back of your mind. I have a bunch of questions that I'm going to ask you later, but I think the underlying question should be, what do we learn about the narrator's time in Germany, his relationship to Elise, and about Japanese and social norms, right? Because ultimately, right, if we think of this as travel literature, we want to ask ourselves, what can we learn from it? So there are a lot of really interesting things in this novel, and I think, or novella, we should probably call it a novella. What's most interesting is the way it's different from the diary. After meeting me, Elise, began to read the books I lent her, and gradually her taste improved. She lost her accent, right? So a Japanese visitor cures this little girl of her whatever accent she had, so she speaks High German. Soon the mistakes in her letters to me became fewer, so he also fixes her spelling. There had grown up between us a kind of teacher-pupil relationship. When she heard of my untimely dismissal, of course, once this becomes public, he's fired, she went pale. I concealed the fact that it was connected with her, but she asked me not to tell her mother. She was afraid that if her mother knew I had lost financial support for my studies, she would want nothing more to do with me. Later on, I neglected my studies. When she came home from the theater, Alice would sit in a chair and sew, and I would write my articles on the table by her side using the faint light of the lamp hanging from the ceiling. These articles were quite unlikely my earlier reports, when I had raked up onto paper the dead leaves of laws and statutes. Now I wrote about the lively political scene and criticized the latest trends in literature and the arts, and carefully composing the articles the best of my ability, more in the style of Heine than Borne. Very interesting. He sort of tells us, the narrator here, what kind of stuff he reads. Heinrich Heine, of course, Borne, another writer popular in Germany at that time. And then, at the very end, after a lot of dramatic things happened, it was some weeks later that I regained consciousness. I had just babbled in a high fever while Alice tended me. Then one day, Aizawa, this Japanese friend, had come to visit me, saw for himself what I had hidden from him, and arranged matters by only telling the Count, that is the superior of the narrator in the novel, that I was ill. When I first set eyes on Alice again, tending me at the bedside, I was shocked at her altered appearance. She had become terribly thin, and her bloodshot eyes were sunk into her grey cheeks. With Aizawa's help, she had not wanted for daily necessities, it was true, but this same benefactor had spiritually killed her. Right? So we see that there's really a lot of high drama happening in this account, in this novella. Now, questions that I want you to bear in mind as you approach the novella. Some of these are pretty much the same, right? I said there is a sort of a set of underlying questions that I always want you to bear in mind. To what degree is the work a product of the language and culture that produced it, i.e. Meiji Japan? What kind of image does it project of the culture or country the writer is traveling to, i.e. late 19th century Germany? What larger socio-historic phenomenon is the work responding to or a product of? And then some more, questions that are probably somewhat more relevant just to this work. Why did a Japanese official travel to Germany in 1884? Why did he write a piece of fiction about what he experienced on top of his diaries? How does his work differ from last week's readings? Right? The work of Huang Zunxian, in terms of focus, style, audience, etc., anything you can think of. What does his short story tell us about 19th century Germany and Meiji Japan? and about both societies at the time. What kind of picture or critique does he paint or offer of Germany, and of course German and Japanese society? And how do we as 21st century travelers react to Mori Ōgai's account of Berlin? Do we recognize it? Or Germany? Do we recognize it? Has anything changed? Is it still useful? Now, under the secondary reading, I posted a short piece by Richard Bowring, who translated Mahime into English, called The Background to Mahime. And he raises some other interesting questions that you might want to consider. So he tells us that the degree to which Ōgai incorporated reality from his experience into the story is a source of, perennial discussion. And he actually offers us some of Mori Ōgai's sister's diary entries about this affair. So that's quite interesting if you want to learn a little bit more about the circumstances. Something else that Bowring asks is the story a tale of the compromise and defeat of a newly liberated youth by the oppressive forces of a feudal, or the residue of feudal Japan tradition? Is it a chronicle of the birth and premature stifling sense of individualism and self-awareness of the major intellectual? It's an interesting question. Does it tap into literary currents of the day, Sturm und Drang of Germany, the romantic ideals that became very popular in Japan during the Meiji period, the I novel or shishosetsu? And here's a question that I want to throw at you. We talked a little bit earlier about these European narratives vis-a-vis Japan. Madame Chrysanthème, this orientalizing of Japan, depicting it as something fragile, feminine. So the question is, can we maybe think of Maihime as a reversal of this narrative? A challenge to the orientalizing of Japan that perpetuated Western fantasies about Japan. That also would make a really great paper topic, I think. All right, we're almost done. I wanted to close with a fun fact about Mori Ōgai. Mori Ōgai liked Germany so much that he decided to give his 5 children German names, all written with Chinese characters, kanji, and pronounced in Japanese. And they read, eldest son, Otto. Second, eldest daughter, Marie. Third daughter, Anne. Fourth child, Fritz. And lastly, Louis. Now, if that isn't a fun fact, I don't know what is. See you next week.